tardes, todos hamsu. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the 2021 Marianas History Conference. My name is Don Rubenstein. I will be the moderator for the session, which, as Levon told you, is entitled Cultural Identities. Our three presenters are Ms. Kristin Oberiano, Ms. Ani San Nicolas, and Ms. Ariel Lowe. Each will speak for 20 minutes and will hold questions until all three have completed their presentations. That will give us about 30 minutes for questions from the audience and further discussion. The first presentation is by Ms. Oberiano. Kristin Oberiano is a history PhD candidate at Harvard University who works at the intersections of United States empire, Asian American history, and Pacific indigenous history. Her research has been supported by various grants, including the US Fulbright program in the Philippines. She has worked as a humanities scholar for Guahan Sustainable Culture's 501c3 public history project, Ginanigoalo, Histories of Farming and Agriculture on Guahan, which is supported by Humanities Guahan and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Ms. Oberiano's presentation is entitled Solidarity Foods, Cross-Cultural Visions for a Decolonized and Food Sovereign Guahan. Please welcome Kristin Oberiano.
Happy day, everyone. Hello. Thank you all for being here at our panel and our presentation. I really appreciate the organizers of the conference, to Dr. Don Rubenstein for hosting this panel. And I'm really, really excited about being on this panel with Ariel and Ani. I've been hearing about your work for so long, and I'm finally happy that I'm actually in the right time zone, in the right space to be able to listen to you. So without further ado, my presentation today is Solidarity Foods, Cross-Cultural Visions for a Decolonized and Food Sovereign Guahan. So I come to this project as a historian of United States empire in the Pacific, in particular looking at Filipino and Chamorro relations on Guam throughout the 20th century. So this project may seem a little bit surprising, but I think you'll see where I'm going with this in terms of food, environments, and decolonization, and how this is connected to Filipino Chamorro solidarities for decolonization. So today I will speak briefly about the decolonization movement on Guam, the role of non-Indigenous peoples in that movement. I will also talk about global food sovereignty and what that means for Guam. And I'll end with a little bit of my family's history and a think piece of what it means to be a non-Indigenous person standing in solidarity with Chamorro self-determination and what that can look like. So my thinking about all of these topics is a work in progress, and I'm still looking for different routes to take this project. And I'm reading a wealth of information and scholarly and community work. So I'm grateful to Dr. Rubenstein for giving me a bunch of resources, but I'm also happy to hear any of you who are in the audience who would like to give me a little bit of pieces of information that I can use to build this project out. So today, I'm not quite sure how to do the slides. Whoever's in charge of the slides, can I just say next? So next, great, thank you. So the movement for Guahan's decolonization. So today, the movement for Guahan's decolonization is centered around the political status of the island, as it should be. So the question of Chamorro self-determination is an important one, and it's the reason why it's at the forefront of our political discussions today. And so this is where we hear about the ideas of independence, of statehood, or free association. In my opinion, the decision of what the political status of Guahan should be belongs to the Chamorro people because of their genealogical and ontological ties to the island. So this includes myself as being a third generation Filipino person. So this island is the land of the Chamorro people, and I believe that any decolonization effort should be led by Chamorro people, and everyone else on island who's non-Indigenous should be following their lead. Chamorro self-determination and Guahan's decolonization is also an overturning of imperialism, and alongside the rest of decolonization of the non-self-governing territories around the world, and to ensure that the political future is decided by the Chamorro people. But this decolonization is usually framed in terms of politics and international law or even imperial law. But what I want to really think about is how to expand that definition of decolonization to other realms of life. So next. So this brings up a question for me. How can allies of the Chamorro self-determination movement stand in solidarity? So on the one hand, non-Indigenous people should be actively demonstrating for our support for Chamorro self-determination by being present at rallies, by listening to the Chamorro people, by voicing concerns, especially towards those who are in opposition, and making our opinions known about this. But I also believe there's another way to contribute to decolonization of Guam that extends beyond the political status. So decolonization also includes how peoples in a society can get rid of the influence of colonization and colonialism in every facet of our life. So to decolonize our language, so for instance, decolonizing the Chamorro language, or for me, learning my actual heritage language such as Ilocano or Ilongo, to decolonize our history. So it's not just about militarism and military bases, but about the land and the people who live within the islands. And to decolonize our education system. So we are not consistently getting a very imperial centered understanding of what our history should look like. But for me, I think that this can be also, or the island can also be decolonized through food. So next. So the global food sovereignty movement is something that is derived from La Via Campesina. And this is a movement of a group of agricultural workers who demanded more political and labor rights in regards to food production in their areas. And this is in Latin America. So they saw how giant agricultural industries were destroying their environments, how although they even worked so hard for these businesses, they were offered low wages, and how they themselves did not have access to the food that nourished them and were culturally relevant to them. So they created this movement to democratize and decolonize the food system that is around them. And this idea and this movement has gone global. So the food sovereignty movement generally is focused on these 5 tenets. You can go back. Go back to the slide that says global movement for food sovereignty. So the food sovereignty movement is generally focused on 5 tenets. Food security is the idea that a community has access to food, that it has enough caloric intake so that people can nourish themselves, and that food can can become insecure in different ways. So this could be from famine, from war, or even from poverty. Food security, on the other hand, means that peoples will always have access to food that can sustain themselves. Food sovereignty, however, as a concept goes beyond just food security. Food sovereignty ensures that the food is culturally relevant and healthy, so that this food is something that people will know how to eat, and that is not just one of caloric intake, but nutritional value. So one case in point for Guam is, as with many islands in the Pacific, is Spam. Right? Spam has become so culturally relevant in our lives, but essentially it is a colonial imposition in that after the World War II, there was a lack of fresh food. So the only way that people can get caloric intake into themselves is through canned goods like Spam. But this is not necessarily healthy for you. And it can, as we continue to eat this, it can lead to chronic diseases that impacts our community. So food sovereignty also means to get control over food production. That means that people have access to food that are not tied to the whims of farmers abroad or to the capitalist desires of businesses, lawmakers, or people in distant places. Control over food production allows to dictate the terms upon which their food is grown, distributed, and sold. And this necessarily requires knowledge of food origins. Food sovereignty does not hide where the food is coming from, how it is grown, whether fertilizers and pesticides were used to grow the food. So an example of this would be to know in which region, in which country or island a food is produced. And this is labeled on the food packaging or on the, it's labeled wherever you buy your own food. And lastly, food sovereignty aims at food production is environmentally sustainable. So this is agribusinesses that depend on large swaths of land, deforestation, pesticides, and fertilizers that deplete the soil's nutrients. For a place like Guahan, it means thinking about how food production could potentially create solid waste and water loss. So instead, thinking about food sovereignty in Guam depends on biodiversity, small farms, natural farming, and depending on the ecosystem in which plants can work well with each other. And it's about capturing that knowledge through science, through indigenous knowledge, through experience, hands-on experience in which we can sort of become more food sovereign on Guahan. So next slide. I think food sovereignty for Guahan is a parallel way of envisioning a decolonized island. So currently, it is estimated that we import 90% of our food into the island, which means we are dependent on outside forces to deliver shipments of food to the island. And these are not sustainable in terms of transportation and shipping. So we rely on ships and planes burning oil to move food from place to place. And these are usually heavily processed and packaged foods that contribute to the waste at the landfills or the dumps. These unhealthy foods have become staples in our household, like I mentioned, but also has contributed to chronic diseases that impact our communities. It is also cost prohibitive to eat healthy. Grabbing expensive greens from the supermarkets, which is nutritionally dense but not high in calories, makes it difficult to put a balanced and healthy meal on the table under budget. But our food system is a symptom of US imperialism. The history of US militarism, international tourism, and even the urbanization of the island has made the island focus more on capital and capital accumulation rather than agriculture. So the dispossession of agricultural land particularly has made it difficult to reinvigorate an agricultural economy in the years after World War II. One example of this, which I explore in my current research, is in 1952 when 129 Chamorro families were evicted from prime agricultural land in the village of Barrigada so that the US military could build its radio communication center for the Cold War. So this land annexation for a short while became known as the infamous case of Radio Barrigada. So families who lived there had large plots of lands that they farmed for their daily food. However, because they were forced to move from there and into newly constructed villages like Dedido on small plots of land, they can no longer grow their own food and were forced to find wage labor in the US military, and thus became dependent on colonial forces to sustain themselves. So the island has become heavily reliant on US routes of empire for its food, and this is in addition to laws that are currently enacted, such as the Jones Act, which makes US laws that regulate shipping to Guam and the territories, and that still contributes to the high cost of living on the island. So food production on Guam has been stymied because of land annexation and direct colonization. But if we turn our attention to make food sovereignty a priority on our island, then maybe there's a way to decolonize our diets and foods, which are the basic necessities of life and are simultaneously a part of and parallel to the conversation on political status and decolonization. So next slide. So there are different things we can do in our daily lives that can contribute to food sovereignty. So we must try to eat local and farm local. We must support our island's farmers so that they continue to grow our island's food. And if you buy locally, you ensure that money that you paid stays on Guam longer, rather than being sent to big businesses in the States. We can also support local organizations that are geared towards environmental sustainability and food sovereignty. So these are folks who are creating the infrastructure or the educational background for the island to be self-sustaining. So here I'm thinking about the Farmers Co-op, Farm to Table, Guahan Sustainable Culture, which I'm a part of, Pacific Farmers Together Cooperative, and among a whole host of organizations and individuals who are working on this work. And lastly, we must change our mindset. Rather than seeing Guam as a place of isolation or the rock that has nothing on it, we must see the island's abundance. How can it sustain ourselves if we pay attention to the land and the waters itself, and how do we respect it? So after all, Guåhan means the place that has. Next slide. So you may be wondering how I got to this question. Well, it's a story of my own grandparents. So both sets of my grandparents were Filipino immigrants who came to the island during 1950s and 1960s. My grandfather on my mom's side was a farmer in the province of Ilocos, and he had always wanted to be a farmer. And this is despite the fact that he had to take an opportunity to move to Guam to earn money and then send it back to his family in the Philippines. So his job was a busboy at Anderson Air Force Base, and even though he lived there, he was always had in the back of his mind his desire to want to farm and go back to the Philippines. But one of my aunties came and decided to stay on or come to the United States, and she came to Guam first. and eventually brought my grandmother, my mom, and my other auntie with her. And so they decided to stay in Guam. They lived in a house on Barrigada Heights when it was first opened back in the 1970s. And in order to supplement the low wages my grandfather earned, he decided to farm in their backyard. So this was a small, not even maybe a quarter acre lot. And he was using the knowledge that he had as a farmer in the Philippines to make the land, the small land that he had, productive. So this photo on the left is actually my grandmother, who they were able to secure some land to produce petchai and food, and they would make it and then sell it at the farmers market or to supermarkets around the area. And here's my grandfather on the right, who's standing next to what I think is probably an eggplant plant. I can't tell, the photo is a little fuzzy, but this is how proud they were of their farming heritage and how they were contributing to a food system on the island by raising the food on Guam. So I remember picking tomatoes with him, eating fresh petchai, bitter melon, having fun in his garden, which was not a ranch, but also in his backyard. And thinking about those days also showed me how that if a person has a knowledge of how to produce their own food, they may never and may not go hungry. And that has made my family less reliant on the supermarket and outside forces for food. And and this is, I think, how we as non-Indigenous peoples can contribute to the island's decolonization that does not decenter or derail the Chamorro self-determination movements for the political decolonization of the island. To contribute through work, knowledge, and experience of farming and food production, which is in our blood, and I'm trying to develop that green thumb, to decolonize the island through our food. So I'm going to get a little bit theoretical here, but feel free to ask me questions about this. I'm inspired by scholars and academics of Asian settler colonialism, specifically Asian settler allies in Hawaii, such as Dean Saranio and Candice Fujikane, and how they are thinking about imperialism and settler colonialism and as related to indigenous decolonization. So how do we as non-Indigenous peoples living in Indigenous lands prevent the further colonization of the land and contribute actively to decolonization? So these folks in Hawaii are looking to see how non-Indigenous peoples could reconsider our relationship to the land, not through the prism of a nation state, but to a people who have genealogical ties to the island. So in other words, how can non-Indigenous peoples like Filipinos like myself not claim that Guam is, quote, US unincorporated territory or where America's day begins, but think of it as land of the Chamorro people? For me, I think this is how we can think of the land as power and what it can provide and respect it and pay attention to it. And I think food sovereignty as a movement is something we can do here in Guahan. So last slide. So to wrap things up, I briefly described how I'm thinking about the definition of decolonization beyond the political, how I'm thinking about the food sovereignty movement in relation to the history of colonialism in Guam, and to see Guam's abundance. I'm also thinking about how non-Indigenous peoples living on Guam can embrace their culture and history and use it to decolonize the island now in this moment, and thus activate immigrant and settler responsibility for those people on Guam, and how we can practice decolonization daily and simultaneous to the political decolonization of Guahan. So thank you, maraming salamat, and sana maasi for listening to me today.